Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for May 14th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation as we dive into the planet of the apes.
We're back. We're back. Damn you, Disney.
Yeah, we're 300 years past Caesar. It's a new era.
Is it actually 300? Because I know the movie opens with many generations, but I don't know if the film ever specified that 300 is the definitive number.
It doesn't, but they've said in interviews.
Okay. Okay, we can take that for what it's worth, I guess.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's what the filmmakers are saying, so I guess I'm just taking that at face value. Who knows? But yes,
Wes
it just
Ball
says many generations later. So.
Yeah. But I don't know. I kind of like the vagueness of that.
Yeah, that's fine. We can pretend it's more vague. Maybe it's 500, 1,000 years.
17,000 years.
Yeah, exactly. We'll keep it vague. Forget the filmmakers. They don't know what they're talking about.
Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't.
It just depends.
In this case, I think 300 sounds like a fair number.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, because it does seem close enough that evolution hasn't taken too much of a stronghold.
It's a believable number.
It's a believable number.
Here.
There's clearly a gap, but it's not too much of a gap.
Right.
300 makes sense to me.
Yeah. Not the 300 that Zack Snyder directed.
No. Yeah, that would be a very different. Imagine 300, but with apes.
Don't retweet about that again.
Maybe that'll be the sequel to Kingdom. Who knows?
Oh, Snyder in the Planet of the Apes.
Oh, could you imagine? I don't
No.
Actually. I don't want to. Never mind.
I don't want to
take
either.
That back.
I don't want my
statement.
feelings on this franchise tainted by something that doesn't even exist.
Yeah, I don't want to spend too much time here. We've talked this franchise to death quite extensively, especially over the last few weeks.
Yeah.
Brendan and I are both huge fans of this rebooted Planet of the Apes. The Caesar trilogy that launched this, excellent. Really, really great. And one thing I just want to reiterate, in case you've missed the bonus content we did some weeks ago, or even the main show, maybe you just want to tune in to hear our thoughts on Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes.
Yeah.
I love Dawn. It's a masterpiece. I love War. I equally think it's masterful. I think Rise is worthy of being in that conversation. I know generally it hasn't been, but I do love that lately there has been a little bit of a retrospective and a galvanizing around that film. And boy, does that make my heart so thrilled. So happy to see.
Since having in-depth conversations about this trilogy in the past few weeks, JD, I did go back and rewatch all three to get myself mentally ready for Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. And in that rewatch, I think I may have liked Rise a little bit more than War.
Okay. That's fair.
I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough with regard to Rise is just how well thought out the storytelling arc is. I mean, that movie is so efficient and great at this, like this sense of constant escalation is really well done. As far as the editing of that film, I think it's quite masterful. That's something we don't talk about nearly enough with regard to Rise of the Planet of the Apes. The editing is really good.
It's fantastic. The effects work of the time especially. It gets better, but in 2011, I think it's very good. Andy Serkis's mocap performance is fantastic.
That was the selling point. It really was great. Yeah.
And as we've talked about, it sets the table emotionally extremely well. Extremely well. Not just the relationship that Caesar has with Franco's character, but obviously Maurice and the other apes that he finds himself with. Like, all of that is just so terrifically woven into that film.
I agree. It sets it up perfectly, which is what makes both Dawn and War so great. And in that rewatch, I did go ahead and bump my rating for Dawn up to 5 stars, which I don't do all that often. I do think it is genuinely, and I don't say this rhetorically or even in a tongue-in-cheek way, I think it's one of the greatest William Shakespeare adaptations of all time. It's Shakespearean. It's not adapting a specific Shakespeare play, but it might as well be.
Yeah.
It kind of is, if you think about it.
Certainly is a tragedy in many respects, for sure.
Yeah.
But I love that film. I think it's one of the best blockbusters of the century so far, for sure. But really, just films. Period. It's great. I love Dawn as well, and I equally love War for many reasons. Especially Michael Giacchino's score is stupid.
It's a character in that film. I was rewatching this trilogy absolutely. I was rewatching this trilogy with my wife Maris, and she really liked Rise. She really liked Dawn, but she admittedly had a hard time with some of the, I guess, the stress factors of the movie, because they are very stressful and sometimes bleak movies. I told her a little bit about War, and she said straight up, "I can't watch that. I'm not watching that with you." So I had to tell her what ended up happening, and I understand it. It's not a knock on War, but that is a very bleak movie, which is why of the three, it is the one I'm going to rewatch the least, just given how it makes you feel. And I mean, that's a praise to the movie, but it doesn't have the rewatchability of the other two.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I think maybe that's why I keep going back to it, because it is bleak, and there's something about that harrowing backbone that many Hollywood studios these days are deathly afraid to embrace. Yeah. And Matt Reeves not only embraces it, he manifests it in such visceral, palpable ways, especially thanks to the score, but the mocap performances, the cinematography at times. I talked about in that
it's an
bonus content, I think it was, or maybe it was on the main show a few weeks ago. I can't really remember, but that moment with the flower, like that flower sequence is great. And also, circling back to social media, one of the clips going viral over the last week is the donkey sacrifice at the end.
Yeah.
And I just love that people are embracing it, especially War and Rise, because I've championed those films since they came out. Dawn, everyone seemed to collectively love.
Dawn was that was the immediate one where everyone just latched onto. And I feel like even of the three, it is the common favorite of the three. And I do think it is the best of the three.
And I get it. Totally justified, totally understand that. Yeah. But there is collectively a resurgence for War and Rise. And as someone who has championed those films since they came out, my goodness, has that made my heart extremely happy. I've loved seeing that kind of reaction over the last week as we lead into Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I guess we can transition from that into the review.
Okay.
So as we noted, many generations later, however you want to interpret that, but it is directed by Wes Ball. This is his first film in the franchise.
Yeah.
And it stars Owen Teague, Freya Allen, Kevin Durant, Peter Macon, William H. Macy, and some others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, many years after the reign of Caesar, a young ape goes on a journey that will lead him to question everything he's been taught about the past and make decisions that will define a future for apes and humans alike.
I love how vague that plot synopsis is, because for the longest time, we didn't even know who Owen Teague was playing. A lot of us thought he was playing Cornelius, Caesar's son. And we thought this was going to be about the legacy of Caesar from an immediate bloodline perspective. And we thought, I almost think the film confirmed that at one point. And then the film started to trickle out. People started to see it a little bit early. Critics groups saw it early. And then we realized, no, this is a very different, not timeline, but this is way past the reign of Caesar.
Yes.
And I thought that was interesting.
Yep. I thought that's interesting as well. I would have loved to see a Cornelius trilogy, but the route they seem to be going, I certainly am not against, at least initially. We'll see where it goes. I know
Right.
we are going to, I don't know if debate is the right word, but we're certainly going to talk about where this franchise seems to be going as it begins this second trilogy of a 9-part saga.
Yeah, we did just find out it's 9 parts, or at
Yes.
least 9 installments, including the Caesar trilogy that we already got.
Absolutely. Beginning where it does, I think is a pretty clever and interesting move for reasons we're going to talk about.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
with all of that laid out, Brendan, what did you think about Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes?
Well, I think it is the right idea to place this movie when and where it does, many generations later, to sort of define it as its own thing, not being too heavily tied to the linear narrative of the Caesar trilogy while still acknowledging its existence. Because this is a film that ultimately, before I ever saw it, before anyone saw it, I think kind of reminded a lot of us of Toy Story 4, where it seemed as though, okay, this was clearly Disney's assignment. Now come up with the idea to make this work. Now, thankfully, with Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, the idea of Caesar's legacy being twisted and kind of morphed in a religious legend-like way, I think is the right idea here. And I think where this film is at its strongest, and where I think the bulk of this conversation between you and I are going to be, or what we're going to have here, it's really around that idea on religiosity. And I think that is where the film is at its strongest. The first half here, I think, is really great. Maybe even the first 2/3 are really great. The whole ape dynamic here really is quite strong once again. And that's really great to hear, because Wes Ball directing this did give me a lot of pause. I admittedly am not the biggest fan of the Maze Runner trilogy. I think the first one's pretty good. But that definitely felt like a director for hire for a studio system trying to play along with the YA movement at the time, right? But here, there is certainly more of an artful quality to the filmmaking. There's more sophistication here. It's certainly it's a much more well-directed film when compared to the Maze Runner films, right? And I think visually it is very compelling. I wouldn't say it's as visually artful as the Caesar trilogy, but the visual effects work is quite masterful. And I was glad to see that, given some of the doubts I had from the early marketing material. So given all of that, and given the fact that Noah, played by Owen Teague, is a very compelling protagonist and framing the movie as a coming-of-age tale primarily, that is where the film is at its strongest. And it's honestly why, even though I don't fully love the film, I think I'm starting to like it more as time goes on, as I think about it, because those elements are very good. I just wonder about where the film concludes, the way the humans get involved, what it seems to be setting up for future films in this franchise. We'll talk about that. I don't want to get into that just yet, but it's in those components where I'm not sure if I'm on the film's wavelength as far as what it's setting up. I'm not sure if I'm interested in where it might be going. So we'll talk about that further, but I think what it sets up initially from an ape versus ape dynamic is very good. And on those merits alone, it is worth seeing, and I hope people do see it, because it has some compelling ideas for sure.
Yeah, I absolutely loved this film. And
that's nice. Okay.
I want to start my thoughts out here. I usually don't tend to do this because it often is fleeting and doesn't really mean all that much. However, I did throw out a tweet over the weekend talking about how I felt about this film as a religious experience, and that it is one of the better religious movies we've seen recently. That getting traction surprised me, honestly, very much surprised me, because I did not anticipate the reaction that I ended up getting. I threw it out there in a fleeting kind of manner, set my phone down, came back, and had a lot of people wanting to engage in a conversation about that.
Both good and bad, right?
Was extremely refreshing. Yeah, absolutely. It certainly sparked some really great conversation, which typically doesn't happen on social media, but in this case,
no, especially on Twitter, it's usually pretty angry, right?
Yeah, and while I was maybe being slightly facetious, I wasn't being unserious with that sentiment either. I'm
Yeah.
not saying that it's the trio of life or anything, but I do think it is a very compelling movie about religion. The whole narrative here is centered on a figure who's been mythologized while his ghost lingers and dictates the actions of every character to one degree or another.
Right.
Now, the franchise has dabbled in religion, but after experiencing Caesar and his extremely moving story, there's more weight to it this time around, which is why I'm willing to forgive the obviousness of the film's biblical symbolism. I mean, his name
Is
is
Noah.
Noah after
It just doesn't
all.
have an H. That's how it's different. It's
Yeah,
not spelled with an H.
His name is Noah. There is a flood that takes place. And the mythologizing of Caesar is very Christ-like. And
Yeah.
not only how they talk about his ethos of compassion and love, with Raqqa being the cipher for that perspective, but also how, as you noted, the goodness of Caesar is exploited for the sake of power and his words being twisted with manipulative intent. Does that sound a little familiar? It
I mean,
should.
yeah, Proximus Caesar. He's basically a stand-in for contemporary pastors and politicians, right? Yeah. Is it obvious? Sure, but is it effective? Kind of.
I agree. As a religious allegory, I think the film is very effective because it's funneled through the prism of Noah's innocence. He's never heard of Caesar. He's a complete blank slate. So what the film does so brilliantly is present a polarity that Noah has to wrestle with on his journey. In every scene, we see him constantly weighing these new things he learns about the world, whether it be Raqqa and his purity of heart and the way he approaches Caesar's philosophy with sincerity, or Proximus, who's gained power by manipulating Caesar's teachings. We, as the audience, know the truth. Obviously, that's why the religious subtext here carries more heft than it ever has before.
It's good
in this
dramatic
franchise.
irony. I like it.
Absolutely. But Noah doesn't know any better. His perspective is key to the film's dramatic and thematic bite because he doesn't know the truth like we do. It simply presents both sides, and he has to figure it out on his own. And the conclusions that Noah comes to, it's interesting to me how truth presents itself through action. Religion can preach one thing, but what do your actions say about you? That's what defines Noah in the end. That's what his arc is rooted in.
Yeah, nice
And-
arc. I love that. I love that.
Thank you. That's not the first time I'm going to do that in this conversation.
Oh, you came prepared with dad puns. I love it.
I had to. I'm sorry. But that's not what defines him in the end. That's what his own arc is rooted in, and I loved that here. I have a few questions of my own for sure, especially as it relates to the ending of this film. But the bulk of the story here isn't about setting up the next movie. It is about Noah and that polarity and the religious subtext that roots it. It's obvious, sure, but given this film and what we know to be true about Caesar and how we know Caesar, how we've loved Caesar, I think this film takes that and manifests something quite gorgeous here.
And this is why I think I'm liking the film a little bit more as time goes on, because I was admittedly caught off guard by the final act and how it felt very setup like. Like that really felt like where the Disney gears were turning to try and franchise this a bit. And it does leave you with that. So you kind of walk away thinking about that more than anything else. But if I look back at the subtext on religiosity leading up to it, that is the bulk of the movie. And the fact that it takes up 75% of this movie and most of that is very effective, that means most of the movie is working. So I shouldn't be as hard on it as maybe I was initially. And you're right, there is an obviousness in the way it presents religiosity and the way it's twisted for someone else's own agenda. And while I don't necessarily mind the obviousness, I mean, it's certainly not as deep or dense as, let's say, a Malick movie or other artful movies about religion.
Yeah, I agree.
But this movie makes the wise choice in what you're talking about in framing this movie through the eyes of basically a child or a teenager.
Yep,
This is a
yep.
coming of age tale. If this
Mhm.
were from the perspective of any other adult, let's say if this were from Rocca's perspective, I think the film would be way less effective. And
Yeah.
I do love the Rocca character. I think
I
he
agree.
serves a great
Yeah.
purpose,
Mhm.
but his arc and his beliefs, that would not serve a great purpose as a lead character. That would make this
Yeah.
2-1 no.
Mhm.
So the fact that this is from the perspective of someone who is very naive and very innocent adds a weight to the simplicity of its notions on religion. And where I think it goes in the end, it seems as though Noah is kind of adopting both ends of that spectrum, both the good
Mhm.
and the bad of Caesar's reign, right? The
Mhm.
good things
Yep.
he represented, but some of the things that Proximus Caesar twisted may actually have some minor sense of truth to it that Noah's going to
Mhm.
latch on to. So it's not about preserving 100% the legacy of Caesar, but how it becomes, I don't want to say manipulated, but how it becomes transformed at a certain time when it needs to be and how it evolves, right? The
Yes.
idea of evolution is certainly part of that, not physical evolution, religious evolution, how that text is then changed for the right time. So the film
Yep.
is addressing those things in a way that I do think is fascinating. And a lot of it is because Noah is a compelling protagonist. I think
Yep.
Owen Teague's performance is really good. I don't
Mhm.
know if it's Andy Serkis level, but it doesn't need to be. You know,
No.
I mean, it's a childlike performance, which is why getting someone like Owen Teague to channel that is very effective. And I do think he is very good
Mhm.
here.
I agree. I think it's reminiscent of, let's say, Caesar and Rise, because Caesar was more childlike in that film.
Yeah,
And this
yeah.
being the beginning of a new trilogy where we're introduced to new characters, this film is introducing some similar parallels in that regard. And I do
Mhm.
love that in the performance for sure. I love it in the writing of the character, the rendering of it, the writing as we've been talking, particularly as it relates to the film's biblical symbolism. And even though I do love me a good pun,
Here it comes again.
Noah's Ark in this film is really, really terrific.
Okay, I
It's
should have
so,
alcohol
so
here. Take a
good.
shot every time we talk about Noah's Ark.
It's so good. Like in those early scenes, it's clear that he has a good art, right? He's an ape who wants to follow the law and respect his elders. When he decides to leave the last egg in the eagle's nest because that's what's been dictated to him. It's
Yeah.
also indicative with how he treats his mother and father. It's his reaction to his village being taken and him feeling some responsibility to get them back. However, that compassion is limited to his own kind because of what he is taught. There is a
Yeah.
fear and a distrust of humans. So when he and Raka come across May, his prejudice is very apparent. And that's where the film's religious polarity begins to show itself, because Raka exhibits Caesar's compassion for humans, and it does affect Noah. Something you contrast later on in the film with Proximus, who tries to claim that this kingdom is built in Caesar's name and that it's for the goodness of ape kind, but it's not Proximus's words that affect Noah, not initially anyway. It's his actions that juxtaposed Raka, and again, it heavily affects him. It
Yeah.
might be obvious, but I love that the film thrives on demonstration. It doesn't
Yeah.
just tell Noah how to feel and act. We see it on screen through Raka's compassion, something
Yeah.
Noah begins to also reverberate a little bit himself. And through Proximus's thievery, you see Noah beginning to understand the heart of Caesar all the more. But then Judas arrives.
Yeah.
There is a betrayal that makes him wonder about Proximus's warnings about the humans. And that little kink in the armor changes so much for Noah and where he finds himself at the end of this film, which I find fascinating because, again, it's not something Noah learns through exposition. It's not something told to Noah. There is an action, again, that word, there is an action that takes place, and how that Judas-like betrayal brings a flood literally and figuratively,
Yeah.
I think is incredible here. It's so fascinating, those dynamics and how the film again utilizes those biblical layers to dictate how these characters react, especially Noah, and that polarity of I don't know what's true about Caesar, but I see Proximus and his brazen thievery and manipulation. I see Rocca's sincerity and earnestness. What's really true, though, is and then you throw this kink in the wrench at the end of the film with this Judas betrayal, and all of a sudden, his whole journey is kind of up in the air, and I love that ambiguity.
Well, it's not even just the ambiguity; it also acknowledges that the biblical tales that we were, I guess, taught growing up, they are filled with wild contradictions, right? And that ambiguity, that uncertainty you're talking about is sort of representative of that contradiction in a biblical sense. It's what I love about this franchise, especially starting with Dawn, because I feel like each film afterwards kind of starts to thematically contradict itself in a way that I really like. Maybe contradict isn't the right word, but recontextualize. Because Dawn of the Planet of the Apes ends in a way that still kind of has this lingering what if about humans and apes coexisting in this world. It is ultimately a movie about cultural misunderstanding and coexistence. Whereas War for the Planet of the Apes kind of straight up says, no, that might no longer be possible. We might be past that point. That's no longer salvageable. Instead, what you can do is simply look out for your own kind and maybe distance yourself from that conflict, which is what makes War for the Planet of the Apes so interesting. I think it might do the whole apolitical thing better than Alex Garland's Civil War from earlier this year.
I agree.
Yeah,
Totally agree.
I think it's much better at that, which is then what makes Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes so fascinating in those biblical notions, because it once again sort of takes this idea that here's a clan of apes that are very distant from the world around them. They're very segmented in their own ways, and that might actually be a problem. So it's still kind of retaining the arc of Caesar and his family at the end of War, looking out for your own kind, your own family, familial loyalty. But 30 minutes into Kingdom, we realize that still does come at a cost. So it's a franchise that adds new layers to how a previous film concluded its arc and its themes, that there is no concrete moral to any of this. And that's amplified further in what you're talking about in those ambiguities and what Noah has to learn, especially in the back end.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I love how this film indulges in what the previous trilogy gave us and is able to complement it with the religious subtext that we do get here, because it does seem as if Noah and his family are able to live in harmony and have their own village where they're able to raise these eagles. And while this might be a little bit of a stretch, I think the whole eagle component is mostly there because it's cool. And I don't know if it goes beyond that, but there is something about
I liked it. Yeah, there's something about eagles that just seem to represent like peace and harmony in a way.
Well, that could be it. I also just simply thought of, and again, this might be a stretch because I'm trying to think of the religious parallel, because his name is Noah, and Noah famously brings animals onto the ark. And while there's not really a whole lot of other animals involved, it is interesting how, eagles are such a big part of their village.
Yeah.
So I guess in a small way, there's a little tie there. But
we do see a few other animals. We see zebras in this one.
Zebras.
And it does.
They do ride horses. We know they ride horses.
We know they ride horses, but when we see zebras here, it actually leads to one of the funniest moments of the film. And this goes back to Rocca and who is it? Peter Macon who plays him. I just want to check, make sure I get that name right. Great performance there. Yeah, Peter Macon as Rocca. His reaction to seeing a zebra, which clearly he has never seen one before, just the way he says, "What is that?"
It's so good.
It's really great. Yeah.
Really funny. Or the moment where they find out some new information about May and they start to put a fire together, and he simply says, "We have a lot to talk about." Great line delivery throughout the film with that character. He's really fun, very charming. I do
Yeah.
love him there. But yeah, as far as Noah goes, I do love the inclusion that they come from this segmented community, but the outside world is not at all what he knows to be true.
Right.
And when that seal is broken, it presents that polarity we've been talking about. And his innocence is so key in making all of that work. But I do love that the film simply presents both sides without being preachy. The only sense of preachiness you might get from this film is the idea, or the fact rather, that we know the truth about Caesar. Therefore, Rocca's interpretation of the mythology is more accurate to what we know to be true. But
It
again,
is.
Noah doesn't know that. And the film doesn't tell Noah or the audience what's true and what isn't. It simply presents Rocca, it presents Proximus. Noah has to figure it out all on his own. And I love that the film pragmatically lets that play out as organically as possible,
Yeah.
while also engaging in his own self-discovery and not necessarily embracing one way or another. Like there's certainly evidence that the compassion of Caesar, he does lean toward, for sure. And there's a moment at the end of the film I absolutely want to talk about, for sure. But as we just talked about with this Judas-like betrayal that he experiences, there is an element of Proximus that he also believes as it relates to the dangers of the humans.
Well,
So, and in a lot of ways, he walks away at the end of this film kind of in the middle.
Kind of
And I just
unchanged in a
find
way.
that
I mean, slightly
fascinating.
changed. Yeah, his arc is not
Yeah.
complete yet. Not complete yet, but he's still building the arc, right?
Still building it,
That's
yeah.
he's still building the arc.
Exactly.
But what I think is great about this movie is it doesn't acknowledge this directly, but I feel like it's cryptically here. Because on the surface, it's almost as if we're meant to take Rocca's word with more direct face value, that his words about Caesar are the truthful words. And while they are to an extent, it does also weirdly acknowledge that Rocca only knows the compassionate side of Caesar. So there may be some truth lost over these generations, which is what happens when legends evolve over time. Things get forgotten, things get manipulated and twisted. So Rocca only knows and believes in the compassionate side of Caesar. He might not be aware of the truth that we know, that at one point Caesar was on a quest for vengeance in war for the planet of the apes. There was a moment that he did kind of embody a Koba-like spirit, which is where Proximus Caesar might have some validity in his interpretation of Caesar. Maybe not quite as much as Rocca, but there are both ends there that kind of have a historical tie to what Caesar at least experienced in the trilogy that we know. So that's what I think is also pretty interesting here, is that the two polar opposites between Rocca and Proximus at one point or another may have represented the real life Caesar, even for a small sliver of time, which is what makes Noah's arc so fascinating, because we know what Caesar was. So the fact that we know that Noah doesn't know is a great use of dramatic irony. Like, it puts us steps ahead of Noah in a way that I actually think is compelling.
Absolutely. I think that's why I love the nuance of where Noah finds himself at the end of this film, because mythology, especially when you're looking at religious figures, there is certainly a black and white quality, I guess, that often comes with those figures.
It's often taught that way, right?
It's often taught that way. And Caesar, in this case, you're right, Rocca looks at the ethos of Caesar from this raw, pure perspective, this earnest perspective. Ape doesn't harm ape. You show compassion and love to the humans as well. Even if they are dangerous, you show compassion and love. And we did see that with Caesar, often throughout that trilogy, for sure.
Yeah.
But the reality is that there is a gray area often as well, or at least there's times, because Caesar was imperfect,
Yeah.
where that did falter a little bit. You mentioned that moment in war. At the same time, I mean, Koba dies at the hands of their fight as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are moments where it might not have been Caesar's intent, but because of circumstances, he had to also succumb to his own ideologies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's, of course, the other extreme with Proximus, who takes it to a whole nother level for
Right.
more manipulative intents, for sure. But when you look at religious figures in the real world, such as Christ, I think that's the more exact,
Yeah.
symbolism that this film is really leaning toward. I mean, Christ isn't taught as if he might have made mistakes.
No,
It's
he's taught as a hero.
He's perfect. He was
Yeah.
sinless, right?
Yeah.
He never made a mistake. Like, that's how it is taught. It is
Yeah.
mythologized as if he is perfect. Like, that's what you have to attain to.
Exactly.
To be
exactly.
sinless like Christ.
Yeah.
Now, in a real world setting, Jesus probably did make mistakes. If
Yeah.
he was indeed human, he made mistakes, as Caesar made mistakes. But that's not how it's presented. And you can either lean into the purity of that, or in Proximus's case, he simply recognizes that Caesar got us to this spot, but beyond that, I don't really care. I'm just going to use it for my own power and to build my own kingdom, which is what he does.
Focused on the strength of Caesar, the physical
Yes,
strength and the influence of Caesar, which is technically not untrue about Caesar, but the intent was certainly twisted for Proximus's own reasons, and that there is a truth in that. So, the more we talk about this, the more I am realizing that the high level presentation of religion in this movie is kind of what makes it secretly deep. It's
Yeah.
well, because in
Yeah,
a way,
yeah.
like religious subtext, as high level as it might be presented, often invites interpretation to go deeper. Like, that's kind of the
Sure.
instinct about religion in general. And as long as the presentation of religion is right and makes sense for the story, it sometimes allows us and asks us to take that deeper plunge. And I think this movie is asking us to do that. So it doesn't need to do the work for us. It's asking us to do the work. And that's what I do appreciate about it. It might seem high level here, but we're doing the work that the film wants us to do, and that's a smart move.
Absolutely. And if you want to look at another scene that the film dips its toes into as far as that religious subtext goes, although, again, this is an obvious parallel, but the film does lean into it, and that is the flood itself. Well, why did God send the flood? Well, it was because of the sin and the violence and the abuse of humanity. And we needed a clean start.
Yeah.
With the kingdom, it's the same thing. It's the abuse, it's the violence, it's the manipulation, the sinning, if you will. It is the exact same reasons in which a flood is needed in order for a clean start to take fold.
Right.
Oh, and his name is Noah. Have we talked about that yet?
I think we talked about Noah's Ark already a few times.
So, like,
take a shot.
Again,
this is not alcohol, by the way, so I can't really take an actual shot.
I mean, even, you remove the obviousness of that, though. I still like how the film leans into that while not making that, I guess, about the religious symbolism, because the flood in context of this movie still makes a lot of sense. Like, for them to dramatically make that happen is organically in line with the motives they would have in that situation.
Yeah, the move that moment doesn't work because it reminds us of the story of Noah and the flood, right? It works because practically this fortress, this kingdom, is on the edge of a beach that could flood this room. Like, physically and scientifically, it makes sense for the story.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's an added thematic and symbolic layer that we can peel from there.
Exactly. And you couple that with how that flood comes at the behest of that Judas betrayal. So there's a couple of different layers working for the film mechanically in terms of that religious symbolism that
Sure.
adds nuance to Noah's arc here and his journey
Gosh,
and
we got to
his
stop doing that.
examination of self-discovery. Like I love that. And then it crystallizes with this final moment between him and May, which I think we should talk about here.
Okay.
Do we want to get into full spoilers, dance around spoilers here?
That's a
do you
good
think?
question because on one hand, I kind of don't want to get into spoilers, but it certainly makes the conversation easier to go more in depth with it. And at
Yeah.
the same time, it might allow us to be a bit more speculative in what we think this franchise will be doing going forward if we go full spoilers.
Okay.
So maybe we should just go ahead and get deep into it.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. So, spoiler alert for the conversation here, the rest of this conversation, because I do want to talk about the ending. I want to talk about that final exchange between Noah and May, where they're having a dialogue, and near the end of the dialogue, there is a shot from behind May where under her cloak, we see that she is holding a gun. And I love that shot of the gun because it emphasizes that May understands the stakes of her betrayal, her Judasing, if you will, and that Noah reacting with righteous anger was possible, maybe even justified, but his actions, again, that word, his actions are once again founded in that learned compassion. He may not fully understand Caesar. He may not fully agree with Caesar, but showing May forgiveness instead of Old Testament wrath says a lot about him. And I love that a simple act of kindness like that completely catches May off guard. And we see that she is undone by the gesture. But given that final exchange between the two, coupled with May's betrayal, Noah, I think, is very aware of the threat of humanity. Proximus was right about that one thing. Noah won't be able to trust them fully. And that will create conflict as we move forward, especially given that final sequence and what it seems to be foreshadowing. The threat of humanity is there. He knows that. But I love that duality in Noah. He shows the compassion. He shows her forgiveness, even though underneath, he also knows going forward, there's going to be some tension between apes and humans.
Yeah. He gifts her this item that Raka had, which in this world is basically a cross. But the symbol is the window in James Franco's House and Rise, which became the ape symbol in the previous trilogy.
Apes together strong.
And that, and that's the symbol for Caesar as it represents here. But he gifts her with that, which seems to suggest something pretty interesting. If there's one thing that I think would be interesting going forward, it's that the human race is the one that needs to learn from Caesar now, which is a pretty interesting idea that a species not ape needs to learn from ape. Like I found that notion kind of interesting if these further films afterwards choose to explore it. And on paper, I also like what you're saying because it sort of presents May and Noah in this almost Princess Mononoke-like relationship. Where they've got different beliefs, different clans that they tend to associate themselves with. The difference here is that there's more of a conflict and a rift between them. There isn't really a form of understanding. And I like that polarity because the movie seems to want to set up the fact that, not set up, but it wants you as an audience member to think that this is a companionship between ape and human that's going to be trustworthy and loving, right? Not romantic, but loving, right? And by the time we get to the end, it kind of pulls the rug from under your feet, you know, when it gets to that Judas-like betrayal. So I like that the marketing, the film itself in the first half is suggesting something only to pull the rug back and recontextualize that in an interesting way. So I like what you're saying, and I do like what that's doing. we can go a little bit further about what the film might be setting up physically that we can also talk about. But I think that moment there, I mean, I think that should have been the final scene of the movie. Honestly.
I agree.
I really do.
The film should have ended there. I think if you get that final exchange, you get that shot of May. I love that close up, and you very much see it there. And the performance of Freya Allen, absolutely love that. If you cut there, you leave it on that ambiguous note, I might even be higher on this film. A+. Wes Ball, incredible job.
I would be, because then it would have maybe fixed my biggest criticism with the movie, which we haven't really talked about yet. It is around the May character, who I, at this point, didn't really find all that interesting. And I don't know if it's Freya Allen's performance. I felt like there was kind of a blandness to her. But if you would have crystallized the movie with that scene, it would have at least made me intrigued to see what this character is going to do next, which is really all you need in a first installment like this. Where it ends up going afterwards, the almost post-credit-like ending that we do get, I feel like it's setting up a conflict that these movies, not just this arc of Caesar, but the entire franchise all the way back to 1968, I feel like it sets up a conflict that we've just seen so many times already. And humans versus apes. Can they coexist? Is it even possible? And I keep on thinking, this just sounds very been there, done that for this franchise. And maybe it's not setting that up. Maybe we'll be proven wrong, but I feel like where it's going is a very superficial way to just build upon itself because we need more movies. And I don't know if we're going anywhere new yet.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I did like the May character. I liked Freya Allen. I liked that she's this mysterious figure that we don't know too much about.
Sure.
Perhaps underwritten. She is essentially a pawn for the religious subtext of the film.
Right.
And I liked that vagueness because
I did
it
too.
serves Rocker early on when he's trying to teach Noah Caesar's compassion and love and why that's important. And even as that relationship goes, like, you do see Noah start to open up to her more, even though there's still a reservation. There's still an uncertainty. I don't know this world all that well. And slowly but surely, he starts to engage with her a little bit more. I think of that moment when he shows the gesture of giving her the blanket and what that means within the context of the film's religious symbolism. I was honestly kind of moved by that. And I don't know if that might perhaps peel the curtain back a little bit as far as my own personal attachment to this story and its religious symbolism. I did relate with Noah in so many ways as it relates to his journey here and finding the truth. And so that gesture of giving her the blanket, even though he still isn't quite sure, but there is something about that compassion and love that he's drawn to.
Sure.
And that feels like the right thing to do. And then you couple that with the moment of him getting on the horseback and riding through the field and saving her there from Proximus's war party, if you will. I loved that moment. I thought that was absolutely a terrific moment that sets up that pulling of the rug that you talked about. And the film earns it because of those little moments. It's not something that happens quickly or briefly.
It's well scripted to get to that point. Yeah.
Absolutely. It spends time through action, again, demonstration, not just telling us these things. We see it through action and Noah exhibiting that Caesar ethos toward May. So slowly but surely that relationship opens up. And even though when they're at the kingdom and he goes into the room and he's trying to talk her into, we got to make this climb, or I want to create this flood. Like, how do we do that? Like, he's still reserved. Like, he still doesn't fully trust her, but there's still somewhat of a bond there that is then broken when that Judas betrayal does come, which gives weight to the forgiveness he shows to her at the end. And I think by her being that pawn for the religious subtext, if you will, by being that kind of vague character, maybe a little off-putting or a little reserved. I think it serves the film in that regard. Now, does the film accidentally subvert itself by giving us that code at the end? Absolutely it does.
Yeah.
I think it's a disservice to the character by doing that.
I think it is. I really do.
Yeah. That is also my biggest issue with the film, because now it suggests that her motives throughout this film were much more sinister than the way it was conveyed earlier. And I don't know how it doesn't recontextualize the film enough for me to change Noah's journey here and the choices he makes.
That is still
think
singular.
all of
That is still its
true.
own thing. Yeah.
I still think all of that is very true. But the idea that she has these sinister motives, like, I don't know if you need to give us that, because the fact that she's fighting for the human survival, that's enough on its own. Like, you don't have to give us all of this extra fluff at the end.
Well, and doesn't it seem very been there, done that for not just this franchise, like I said, but also for many post-apocalyptic movies about humans trying to reclaim their planet? It just doesn't feel very new. And for specificity, we aren't spoilers after all. She basically needed to acquire this device that allowed them to connect to various satellites, that allowed them to reach more humans dispersed around the world who apparently can still speak. I mean, the film hasn't even addressed that yet. After war, there's still a subset of humans that apparently haven't lost their sense of speech, but they're trying to reclaim the planet. And it still lingers on this question, humans and apes, will they or won't they? And I don't need that question anymore. I feel like Dawn and War sort of crystallized that idea. Leaving it on just Noah and May and that resolution they had together is enough weight to carry that idea in a new lens.
I agree, because I think what's interesting, we noted earlier that this takes place some generations after the events of Caesar.
Yeah.
But it's not too far into the future that evolution has taken too much of a hold. And it's not just the apes, the same goes true for humans. Yeah. So given what we had seen at the end of War, it does seem to suggest that those groups of humans that could talk, that could interact in what is a normal capacity, that is dissipating quickly at the end of War, for sure. And now that we're some 100 years down the line, it makes sense that maybe there's a pocket of humans that are still able to communicate traditionally, while most humans have become mute as a result of the virus. But there's still pockets of humans that can still communicate, that are still fighting for their space in the world. That presents a new element that, for all the reasons we just talked about, especially as it relates to the religious symbolism, is extremely effective here. But then to mitigate that by going, actually, there's large pockets of humans everywhere, apparently. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, there's a huge bunker of humans that can talk.
And of course, they're throwing in all of these Easter eggs here. So they mentioned Fort Wayne, Indiana. Apparently Fort Wayne is, I'm sure you're aware of this, Charlton Heston's Taylor. His character was apparently from the Fort Wayne hub, I think.
It's also where I grew up playing hockey. So thank you for that. They should have put my name in the credits as well.
This franchise is about you now.
Exactly.
But you can tell that it seems as though this franchise, and I think Wes Ball in interviews has also alluded to this, they haven't forgotten about the astronauts on Icarus that went lost in space. That was alluded to in
Rise. A lot
Rise.
of shots of foreshadowing in this film for that.
Yeah, they're like the telescope observatory. There are sketches of astronauts there. So clearly, they're clearly trying to reach the outer rims of Earth and get us closer to that original Planet of the Apes in some way. So that's pretty clear what they're doing. And I don't necessarily mind us getting closer to that original film. I just feel like the way that this film goes about it in its final minutes does undercut what was fascinating about the dynamic between Noah and May. Because like I said, I didn't love May as a character, and it's not that she was underwritten. I think if anything, it may have been more of a performance thing. I didn't love Freya Allen all that much, but I loved her in that final scene. And I think if it would have concluded there, I would have at least felt an interest into where that character was going. That was the only moment I needed for recontextualization of that character. And where it went afterwards, I thought was a little bit deflating.
Yeah, that close up of her and her reaction,
Mhm.
the poignancy on her face when she receives that gesture, that
Mhm.
token from Noah, I
Yeah.
think was impeccable.
Yeah.
And then you just get a shot of her walking away, cut to credits, perfect. I think that would have been fantastic. Now,
That's fine.
from a franchise building perspective, I guess that's why they put that in there, because now they've stated this is going to be part of a 9-film saga.
Yeah.
And this is where, for those that listened to the main show this last week, forgive the redundancy, but this is where I get concerned, because they're clearly setting up another war between humans and apes. And to your point, we have seen that before, not just
Yeah.
with the original 5 films, but even the previous 3 and now 4 in this franchise.
Mm-hmm.
They've all, to one degree or another, albeit in different and interesting ways, they've all examined the idea of coexistence between apes and humans.
Yeah.
I don't know where at this point, especially if we're inching toward another war, how you differentiate this war that's different from the Caesar war.
That is my biggest concern right there.
It's my
And-
biggest
yeah.
concern as well. And I noted on the main show this last week, up until this point, and I will include Kingdom, Rise, Dawn, War, Kingdom, I think have done a great job of, while being popcorn entertainment, yes, they have been artistically driven. There's been an ambition to these films that I love, that I adore, and I'm dubious if they're going to be able to maintain that given what they're setting up here.
Yeah.
And it seems to me as if all they want to get to now is time travel and space aliens and things that might be entertainment, but I don't know if you're going to get the artistry. Like, I feel like
Yeah. That
in
that's,
lieu
that
of
scares
one,
me.
we're going to get the other. And look, I have nothing against space aliens and time travel. That's a big part of the first 5 movies.
Yeah.
But there's something about the lack of that here that has made this reboot refreshing and different from its predecessor.
Yeah.
And that's made it so much more emotionally foreboding that
yeah.
I've absolutely loved. Now, maybe they'll be able to make that work. Space
If they can ground it
travel
in a
and-
way. Yeah. If they can make it still feel of a piece with this particular portion of this franchise that is seemingly more based in reality, the best way I can describe it.
Yeah.
There is a grounded nature to it when compared to something like Beneath the Planet of the Apes, right?
For sure.
Okay, say what you will about that movie, but that ending rocks. It's just
Yeah.
unfortunate that the rest of the movie is not very good, but that ending is awesome.
Sure.
But that the tonality of that ending and just the circumstances of it at this point now don't fit within this subset of this franchise. Like, it just doesn't. And if it's going closer into that direction of mutant humans worshiping an atomic bomb, you have to do the right work to get us there.
Yeah.
And if that is where we're ultimately going to be going and time travel gets involved, and who knows, maybe some time traveling version of Caesar comes back,
Yeah.
you have to be able to do the work to make that,
Mhm.
for lack of a better term, you have to make it earned. You have to earn it.
Yeah.
And we're not there yet. We're not even close to earning the ridiculousness of that yet. And that's what worries me, honestly.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, and you think about that original Planet of the Apes,
Mm-hmm.
where the apes have clearly evolved into this super advanced society
Mm-hmm.
that is a clear distinction of where we're at now.
Mm-hmm.
And the year in which it takes place, I can't really recall.
It was
when they
3,900 or something like
yeah,
that.
like it's thousands of years into the
Yeah.
future.
Yeah, we're not time wise. We're not even close to that.
Not even close to it.
Mhm.
So I don't know if bringing in those elements makes sense for where this story is taking place just a few hundred years removed from Caesar. Like the
Yeah.
evolution hasn't taken its course yet. So while I'm open to the idea of space travel and space aliens and everything weird nature that those original movies give us, I'm open to them if they can make it work. But you're right. Tonally, it just seems like we're so far removed from that. It just doesn't make sense. But it feels like narratively, they're setting up.
They want to go that way.
A story here that is going to be more about that popcorn entertainment and less about the emotion and thematic texture of these four movies.
Those final minutes really reminded me of not narratively, but tonally and aesthetically, even for a moment. The final minutes here really did remind me of the Maze Runner films. Like it started to take me back to like, okay, now we're shifting gears into basic popcorn entertainment. It didn't feel of a piece with the sophistication that Wes Ball was bringing to the movie for roughly 80% of it. It's a well-crafted movie. We talked a lot about the film's biblical themes and the subtext there, and even talked about the ending, but Wes Ball does deserve some credit for really coming of age himself as a filmmaker. I think he has said that he did struggle a little bit with the Maze Runner films because they were very much studio mandated projects. So he was certainly working on a certain timeline and a budget to get those films made. And then there were unfortunate issues with who is the star, Dylan O'Brien. I think he was injured at one point on set, and that led to some complications in the making of the remaining films in that trilogy. But here you could tell he's making something with more sophistication, as if he's learned from his process. And I like that it was evident here. But that ending kind of also contradicts the sophistication of the movie making here then too. I don't think it fits. It just doesn't fit for me.
I agree. So I'm dubious. I'm concerned about where this is going to go forward. However, to also reiterate something I said on the main show this last weekend, and I talked about this on social media as well, I'm going to wait until we get those future movies. Obviously, I'm not going to prejudge them. At this point now, with the Caesar trilogy and now the first of Noah's, I think this is my favorite franchise at the moment. I've loved these four movies. I am concerned about the future, but as we are right now with these four movies, and I'm not going to put too much stock into that ending because it is just ultimately a few minutes.
It is
of a 2-hour plus movie,
right? A lot of our criticisms right now are still kind of speculative, so we don't know for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
I agree. I still don't love how it subverts May. That criticism will always exist unless they recut this movie and remove that ending. And Wes Ball has said that there is 40 extra minutes of footage, I believe, that who knows could make it into a director's cut.
I would be curious to see that, actually. I would like to see what more there is, especially from a human/May standpoint. I think there's more there to be explored.
I would love to see a director's cut that includes that extra footage and removes the coda we get here. That would be the perfect balance for me. I know that's selfish of me, but look, the ending is what it is. You remove that. I love everything else. And I think it's a great compliment, a great starting point for Noah and his journey off the heels of what we just experienced with Caesar. And, that cannot be overstated as well. You're talking about Wes Ball coming of age as a storytelling here. The one thing I haven't even mentioned yet, I do love how this film looks visually. I also had some concerns, but I think the visual effects here are very good, great even. Yeah. The cinematography, I do think is very appealing. And even in terms of the storytelling, like I love how he infuses the film with that religious symbolism without it ever being overtly on its face. It really is about these characters and the circumstances they find themselves in. But Caesar's ghost is layered into the world building and mythology of this film in every scene. It's layered in.
You sense him. You really do. Yeah.
It's very much there. But again, without being preachy. It is never preachy.
Right.
The film simply presents that polarity, and we let Noah play in his sandbox.
Yeah,
and at
playing
the
his ark.
end of it, playing his ark. Exactly. Bring in a few eagles and some zebras.
Yeah. Yeah.
onto the ark, and by the end of it, he hasn't really chosen a side. He's still in the middle, like he very much embraces Caesar's compassion and love, but he also embraces Proximus's warnings of humans and the danger they pose.
Yeah.
It's very much both. And so now going forward, it's going to be interesting to see where he goes, because I think there's a path laid out here for him where he could go either way. He could become another Caesar, or maybe he'll be the next Proximus. I see both paths for him.
Yeah, I do too. And that, honestly, JD, I'm glad we had this conversation in this way, because it is making me appreciate the film a lot more than I did while walking out of the theater. Because admittedly, when you leave a movie, you tend to initially lock on to how it concludes, and sometimes that can leave a sour taste in your mouth if you really don't like the ending. And leaving the theater for this movie, I was left with that sour taste in my mouth, because I really did not care for that ending and what it seems to be suggesting for the future of this specific franchise, this 9-film saga that they're working on here. Okay.
Yeah.
But despite that, the majority of this movie is what works about it, is the good stuff about it. So percentage-wise, mathematically speaking, it is a very good movie. And it kind of raises this question: can a movie be broken by an ending that just doesn't work? Sometimes it can. I'm going to reserve judgment on this movie in that way until we see where it goes. But if this ultimately does go in the direction that we are speculating it to go, then I will probably end up liking this film a little bit less as time goes on.
Okay.
But it's unfortunate saying that, because I think what we spent the bulk of this conversation talking about is really compelling. I think 80% of this movie is really darn near great, if not very good, darn near great.
I agree.
And that's what I'm struggling with.
And maybe the disparity with us is I think I will have no problem compartmentalizing those two things.
Okay.
Because the ending of this film does seem as if it was perhaps directed by the studio themselves.
It was.
It feels like a separate short film that they tagged onto this movie. And while it might slightly subvert the main character for the reasons we talked about, however, if you just think about the film ending with that final exchange between her and Noah, I think the film on its own terms still works great despite the ending.
I agree. And I will say, despite the ending, Noah's arc is at least
exactly.
It's at least that's the arc that matters.
Exactly. That's
his arc is
intact
still preserved.
no matter what.
It's still preserved. Yeah.
It's still preserved. I love that. That final moment of him taking, I forget the other character's name there. But they go up to the telescope. I
believe it was.
Yeah, and they're looking into the telescope. Like, all of that is so beautiful and gorgeous. I love the poeticism of it. It's really fantastic. All of that is still very much intact.
Sure.
If the franchise ends up going in the direction we're speculating, I will mostly just be disappointed that it goes in a direction that will undermine, again, Noah's arc. Because it establishes Noah as a fascinating character here, where if the next two films hit, we're going to have another great trilogy on our hands for Noah before we get to whatever the third trilogy is.
Yeah.
But if they end up going in that direction, it's just going to put a halter in all of that. And
it's unfortunate.
And I'll just be disappointed. I'll be heartbroken for Noah, because what they've started here, I think, is fantastic. And I hope that they give him justice without sending him, on an interstellar space mission with McConaughey and Anne Hathaway.
Or he finds contact with Mark Wahlberg,
exactly,
and Tim Roth, and everyone there, and Helena Bonham Carter and Tim Burton.
I know we live in a world of universes and multiverses and things of that nature.
We're at a point where that is still possible, right?
I hope that doesn't happen, but we live in a day and age where it's certainly very possible. You are right. So
yeah,
if we're going to get there, I hope it's in the last trilogy, where, again, you can go thousands of years into the future and you can include some of that weird goofiness that we love about the franchise. It's just not appropriate right now.
Yeah.
Let Noah's Ark play out organically. Let it be about his evolution as a character without including, space demons or whatever.
Space demons. I hope not. Owen's a great new protagonist, and if anything that this film does to do right, because it had a lot to live up to give us a new protagonist, right? Caesar is one of the great protagonists of the past 20 years. Noah Noah's not on that same level, but he's close enough for a franchise like this to really hold a strong movie. I think he's very compelling.
And look, I don't know who's doing the next movie if Wes Ball is doing it. Whoever is mapping out these movies, if they're listening, let me remind you of Adam Driver's recent interview where he talked about what J.J. Abrams established for Kylo Ren, where he was going to be the complete antithesis of Darth Vader. That's what I love so much about him in The Force Awakens. He's a child that thinks he's Darth Vader, but he's a child.
Yeah.
They were clearly setting up that character to turn to the dark side and go fully into it.
Yeah.
The opposite trajectory of Darth Vader.
Yep.
Sometimes the best thing is the most obvious thing. That's okay. It's okay for us to know where you're going to go with the character. It comes down to execution. You don't have to necessarily surprise us or flip the script. They should have committed to that with Kylo Ren. Here's an opportunity where you have a character and the path is set forward for him to have the reversal arc of Caesar. I'm just saying, if you write that out, let that play out organically, you could have something interesting there. And you don't have to overthink it. Don't overthink it. It's there. It makes sense. And given the religious symbolism of this film, I think that there's a fascinating component there because we don't need another Christ-like figure. That already exists with Caesar.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is whoever is doing the next film in this franchise, whatever it ends up being titled, don't hire Rian Johnson.
Or hire Rian Johnson and turn Noah to the dark side. That's what I'm trying to say here. Okay.
And I say this as someone that really likes The Last Jedi.
Yes. Like, I know this isn't a Disney property, but this is an opportunity for them to remedy that and take this young Padawan.
It's like, hey,
who's conflicted.
We can have a plan. It's like, see, here's the other thing that actually gives me some hope that they'll plan this right. There is no official release or confirmation that a sequel to this is even happening. Yeah. Based on the box office results, we might. I mean, this is just under 130 million worldwide, I think, at this point that we're recording this. And the movie's budget was 160, so it hasn't made that back yet. It still has a ways to go. But
it's on its way. It's on its way.
I think, it's on its way, and it doesn't have much to compete with this weekend outside of John Krasinski's If. And I don't think that's going to give it too much of a run for its money.
No.
I mean, although the B cinema score for this movie is a little concerning. I was kind of surprised by that, given the A minuses for the previous trilogy. So I hope that doesn't hurt it. I hope audience relations with this movie is still positive enough that it still carries money and it makes money going forward. But I think it will. I don't think it has much to compete with next weekend. That it will still be the king, if you will.
I agree. I know we're going kind of long here, so any final thoughts on Kingdom for the Planet of the Apes?
A few things, actually. Just a few passing comments. First off, William H. Macy, what the hell are you doing in this movie?
I love how we've talked for over an hour here, and we didn't even mention him. I don't even think I brought him up as far as the cast goes.
I think I forgot he was even in the movie for a while. So yeah, okay. William H. Macy's in this movie. He's not playing an ape. He's playing a human. Doesn't really do anything here.
Just reading old Roman text to Proximus. That's it.
Yeah, that's it. Kevin Durant as Proximus.
Oh yeah, need to mention him. Yes.
Yeah, he's very compelling here. So that's really good. So at least mentioning that here. A few other passing comments. One not related to Planet of the Apes. Then I'll circle back to Planet of the Apes as a franchise. But this movie does star Owen Teague and Freya Allen. I could totally see Wes Ball casting them as Link and Zelda in his upcoming Legend of Zelda movie.
Okay.
I'm not saying I like it or dislike it. I just could see it happen. I could see the visuals there, and I've heard some people saying that that's something that could even happen as well. So just a
Okay.
passing comment. Still a little concerned about that movie, but Wes Ball surprised me here, so maybe he'll surprise me there.
Okay.
The last final thought I have, and hopefully this doesn't take too long of a conversational point, but with regard to the franchise as a whole, the Planet of the Apes franchise as a whole, have you seen all of the films, right? All 10 of them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the original 5, it's been quite a while, but I've seen them all.
Well, I was going to ask, do you have a ranking of it or anything like that?
Oh, man.
Or is it too premature to ask that?
I'd have to go back and revisit those films to give you an honest answer.
Okay.
Because it's been so long. I don't know. I don't even know if I have an answer. It's been over a decade since I've seen those films. Maybe even longer than that.
I do really want to rewatch them. So maybe that'll be good. That might be good bonus content collateral if we do a rewatch of them and just talk about the franchise and all 10 films there.
Yeah. Okay.
I will say, I don't know what my official ranking is at this point. I'm like you. I have to rewatch a lot of them. I will say I do think the 4th film, Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, is really, really great.
Yeah,
and that's one I'm really excited to give a revisit, especially the director's cut, which I hear is absolutely horrifying.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to do that at some point, whether for bonus content or as we gear up for the next one, whenever that comes out. But I'd be down to do a Planet of the Apes movie series, perhaps.
I was just going to say, maybe that's a movie series topic right there.
Yeah, we could do that in between our Best Picture decades. I think that could be a lot of fun because I remember enjoying them all to one degree or another, especially that first film I think is excellent. I think its reputation is very well deserved.
I love when we brainstorm about the future of this podcast mid-show.
Yeah, and I even like the second one I really like too, as weird as it gets at times. And I mean, like they all have various things that I appreciate to one degree or another for sure.
Yeah,
but I can't really speak to them without being kind of broad.
Yeah, the only one I remember really disliking was the 5th one, Battle for the Planet of the Apes. I think that's one where you really got to notice the limited budget that they just couldn't take advantage of.
Yeah, that one is pretty cheaply made for sure.
Yeah, I remember not liking that one, but I do remember liking the one before it, Conquest, like I said.
It has some darker undertones for sure. Yeah, which I also appreciate. But again, I can only speak to it vaguely because I haven't seen them in so long. But that would be a great series. I would love to do that for sure.
All right, marking it down.
All right. Well, as far as some other final thoughts from me, I just want to reiterate Kevin Durant, I think, is fantastic here. He's really, really great. Proximus might be slightly underwritten, similar to May, but I do love that they keep it pretty straightforward because of the polarity the film is presenting, because it is not about Rocca or Proximus. This movie is not about them. They are ciphers. Both of those characters are ciphers for these different ideologies, interpretations of Caesar's ethos.
Yeah.
And they need to be representative of those extremes. And I think they both do that very well. We talked about Rocca and how charming and funny he is, how sincere and honest he is with Caesar. Proximus is that other extreme. He's manipulative. He has these sinister intentions. He's going to steal your village and abuse those apes for his own purposes. He claims it in Caesar's name, but it's obviously for his own power. And the religious symbolism there, I think, is effective by committing to that extreme. So the character doesn't have to come with a lot of nuance. In fact, weirdly, I think that would undermine that polarity, because it's about presenting these extremes and letting Noah figure it out. Yeah. But at the same time, there's enough with the characters, both with Rocca and with Proximus, though. There's enough with both of them where you see Noah react to them, and they're compelling on their own, that by the end, as we've been talking about, Noah kind of finds himself in the middle. Yeah. And both of those characters are important in making or giving that credence.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I do
Agree. I agree with
really
that.
like both of ththose characters. I like how they're rendered here. The performances are great. Owen Teague, fantastic as well. I really like this film a lot. Loved its religious subtext for all the reasons we talked about here. Up until the coda, I think it's pretty great.
I'm liking it more based on this
pretty worthy of
conversation.
being with the Caesar trilogy. So
Yeah.
I hope these next two films, at the very least, I assume they have somewhat of a plan if they have a 9-film saga in the works.
No, they better. And they're
That
not just
whatever
planning
these-
to have a 9-film saga.
Yeah, if that's already in the works, hopefully they have a plan, and hopefully that means that these next two films will be able to conclude Noah in a way that gives that character justice.
Agreed.
And again, I think that could mean turning him to the dark side, if you will. I think would be compelling.
That'd be interesting.
At any rate, I mostly really love this film. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, of course, reach out to us. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment below. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com as well. Brendan, anything else before we get out of here?
Once again, barren wasteland behind me. It's slowly trickling away. This is the second to last review, technically, that you'll see this background behind me. So I'm going to keep making note of that. But yeah. It's
Okay.
the move is coming. Changing
coming.
gears. I'm going to miss this white wall behind me.
Yeah. The next week on the show, Brendan will be reviewing from either his car or the dumpster behind some apartment building in Philadelphia.
It'll be a
Who
garage.
knows? Maybe he'll be in the trash can with Oscar the Grouch, perhaps.
I'll be in the Eagle Clan from Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I'll be hanging with
There you
the
go.
Eagles.
The Eagle
No,
Clan.
Noah will be right beside
There
me.
you go.
I'll be teaching him how to play bass.
It'll be Brendan and Noah. Absolutely love that.
I'd love to. Do that
Well, with that, we'll go ahead and wind down here. I know we've gone long, so thanks everyone for listening, staying with us here to the end.
Yeah, seriously.
We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and we hope that you enjoyed the movie as we did. With that said, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. You see, it was Noah's Ark. You understand? Noah's
Do you
ark.
get it?
His arc in the movie.
Yeah. I don't get it.